Hello, and welcome to Suicide Prevention for Schools, a part of the Lifelines trilogy. My name is Nicole Diamore-Nolan, and I'm with the Mental Health Association of Monmouth County. Today, we're going to talk briefly about what suicide prevention looks like for a whole school community. Before we begin, we want to go over what it is that we want you to know today and what we want you to walk away from this training with. First, we want to discuss why suicide prevention is important in your school. Second, we're going to discuss why your role in suicide prevention for your students is critical but limited. And finally, we're going to talk about all of the great work that your school has been doing to promote youth suicide prevention with the Lifelines curriculum. Why is prevention in schools important? First, as educators, you know that our youth and teens are spending the majority of their time in schools and in their school buildings. This puts you at a critical position to be able to understand and notice any behavioral changes in students that may be contributing to their risk for suicide. Additionally, prevention falls under the mandate to provide a safe learning environment for students. What we know is that when students are so impacted by the thoughts of wanting to die, learning cannot take place. If you've been through a Lifelines training before, you've heard us talk about our competent, caring community model, and this helps us create a safe school. In a competent school community, everyone is concerned about the welfare of all members of the community. This is why we've done the training in the way that we have. We've started with administration, we've trained crisis team members, we've trained your teachers who are actually going to teach this curriculum to your students, and now we're talking to the whole school community, and eventually we will do a presentation for parents as well. The last piece of this is bringing students into the mix. And what we know about students is that they are the most underutilized resource when it comes to suicide prevention. A competent school community is also committed to an environment that supports the common good. We've seen this time and time again when working in high schools and middle schools, is that no one ever wants their friend to die by suicide or even somebody that they don't know that well. And if we can support a caring community where everyone is concerned about the well-being of its members, that's our common good. Finally, the competent community is all about providing resources and making sure that every member knows how and where to get help if a community member is in need. And this speaks to all pieces: your auxiliary staff, your faculty, your students, administration, and parents. We all know what to do when we're concerned about the well-being of a student or even an adult. The competent caring community reminds us that we're all in this together and that everyone has a role to play in suicide prevention. That being said, it has a number of key stakeholders that make up the competent community. We have school board members, administrators, faculty, staff, parents, and students. When we've done this work previously, what we know about bringing everyone together in this model is that everybody feels that they have a place at the table and that they are part of prevention. This inclusive model allows for individual voice and choice, where students feel heard, parents feel supported, and faculty and staff feel that there's the structure that they need in order to control their classroom and provide the best learning environment for their students. So going back to our second key part of what we're going to learn today is understanding your role in the school as an educator in youth suicide prevention. And you'll hear me say this a couple of times throughout our training today. Your role is critical but limited. Because of the amount of time that you spend with your students, you are going to learn, identify, and refer much more frequently than probably any other person in their life at this point. Additionally, what you're going to think about is how you would do this and what it looks like in your school. We're not asking you guys to become mental health experts. What we are asking is that you're able to identify and know the signs of risks in your students, and that you're able to refer them using your in-school resources. One of the most important pieces that comes out of our Lifelines training is the school-based definition of suicide. And why people really like this is it moves away from a medical model and is really behavioral based and empowers educators to be able to do something with such an overwhelming problem. Suicide is an attempt to solve a problem of intense emotional pain with impaired problem-solving skills. Why people like this definition? First, let's talk about the impaired problem solving. As educators, you've been practicing for this your entire career. You know how to teach problem-solving skills. This puts the issue of suicide back in your wheelhouse and helps you address a problem of intense emotional pain with something you're able to teach. Additionally, the problem of intense emotional pain speaks to the fact that no one ever wants to die by suicide. They never want to end their physical existence. They just want the problem to stop. And when we speak to our students from that place, and when your counselors will be able to take the referral that you've noticed, this is what they've been trained on through Lifelines, to be able to speak to that problem of emotional pain and to give them the skills that they need to have better problem solving. As we discussed in the last slide, we're talking about a problem that our students are going through that is intensely emotional. So what does that feel like? I want you guys to take a minute and think about a moment in your life where you were experiencing a crisis. I want you to close your eyes and think about some of the emotions that maybe you felt during that time. Maybe you felt worthless or hopeless. You felt like you were helpless in the situation, that there was really nothing you could do. Maybe you were embarrassed. There was shame or guilt or confusion, emptiness and desperation. When we do this training in person, typically we get some answers of anxiety or anger. These are feelings that your suicidal students may be experiencing as well. And looking at it of intense emotional pain allows us to be a little bit more compassionate and say, yeah, maybe we do know what this feels like. But as an adult, as somebody who is able to have healthy problem-solving skills, you've been able to avoid feeling suicidal at your life. And maybe that's something that you can't understand. But what you can understand is what intense emotional pain may feel like. And this may have come at a point in your life where maybe you experienced a loss, could be of a marriage or a family member or even a job, or there were other things that went on in your life that really were intense for you. This is how we can relate to our students. And now you know what intense emotional pain may feel like for them. One characteristic of suicide that we'll talk about briefly is that it makes our problems seem unsolvable. Suicide becomes the only way out, and there's really no other option. For those of us with healthy coping skills, we're able to see that we can reach out for help, or there are other alternatives. But when someone is feeling truly suicidal, their problems have become that unsolvable mountain that they really feel they can't get over. For instance, this may be getting into trouble at home, in school, or with the law. They may have been humiliated in front of friends, and this goes especially for boys. Loss of a relationship, an opportunity, or a dream. This can go beyond a loss of a family member who has died. This may be something as getting into the military or getting into a dream school or getting their dream job or even dating somebody in high school that they really had enjoyed. Any type of loss can be a triggering event for a student who's feeling suicidal. Also, transitions and change for which the student feels underprepared. These are all types of problems that can seem unsolvable. Next, we're going to talk about suicide risk factors and warning signs. The Lifelines trilogy uses the metaphor of a traffic light. That red light is going to be your warning signs, which really tell you that you immediately need to stop. You need to refer that student to your in-school support staff, and that an assessment is probably warranted. That yellow or amber light indicates the risk factors for that student. We're going to talk about those in a little bit, but those are basically telling us to have some caution and to slow down and to keep an eye on that student. Green lights are our protective factors, or those barriers that help us protect students from risk. That can be things as school connectedness or having a trusted adult. Next, we're going to watch a short video on warning signs. This video can be found on the DVD that accompanies your Lifelines Prevention textbook. This warning signs video is done by Maureen Underwood, a licensed social worker who has spent her entire career working in the field of youth suicide prevention, and she's the author of the Lifelines trilogy. All right, now taking what we've learned from that video, we're going to talk a little bit about what you need to know about risk factors. Remember, risk factors are those yellow lights that tell us to slow down. They increase the possibility that someone might be suicidal, but it doesn't necessarily indicate that just because a student has this risk factor makes them suicidal. That being said, most of your students enter school with risk factors, leave with risk factors, and are never suicidal. There's always more than one risk factor for suicide. And your school may never know what a student's risk factors are. And that's the complicated piece of suicide prevention. I want to talk to you guys briefly about the most serious risk factors for youth. First, having had made a previous suicide attempt puts somebody at a higher risk for dying by suicide. This is an example of one of those things as an educator you may never know. But if you do have a family that shares this information with you, you should certainly have it on your radar and watch out for your student. Remember those yellow flashing lights, and remember when you need to slow down and move to the red for those warning signs. Having access to legal means within somebody's home is certainly a risk factor for youth. A large portion of the work that's being done across this country in mental health and suicide prevention is educating communities and families on how to safeguard their homes and reduce the means that children have access to. Again, we're going to go back to warning signs, and we like to use the acronym FACTS. Feelings, actions, changes, threats, and situations. These are all things that are going to indicate to you that that yellow flashing light now needs to go to a red. You need to slow down, put on the brakes, and involve your referral process within your school building immediately. Feelings may be anything from an increased anger. You may see some signs of depression, maybe increased anxiety. Actions are just going to be anything that's out of the norm for the student. Maybe you're concerned that they're not handing in their homework, showing up late to class. This kind of goes along with changes, just any general changes in behavior. Students may not be hanging out with their typical group of friends, or you may see them isolating more. Threats are pretty straightforward. Those direct threats that you hear about wanting to die, or maybe things developmentally such as going to sleep forever and never waking up. Remember, threats are sometimes developmental, so if you're working with a younger student, it may not be including language of, I want to die by suicide or I want to kill myself. Anything that may be a threat that sounds like they no longer want to be living is something that you need to be concerned about and communicating directly to your school support person. Finally, situations. And those are going to be back to those things we discussed earlier about an unsolvable problem. This is usually a triggering event for a child that kind of just pushes them over the edge. Again, think about those things with students getting in trouble at school or home with the law, a breakup or a perceived or actual loss. Any type of situation that could be a triggering event for your student, you're going to put those brakes on and speak to somebody about your concerns. So putting this into perspective for you guys, what are some of the warning signs you may see in school? Previously, we discussed changes in student appearance. Maybe they're no longer put together, or they're coming into school a little disheveled, or their hair is a mess. Changes in mood, for example, no longer cheerful or suddenly cheerful. And I want to focus on that for a few seconds with you guys, because sometimes having that suddenly cheerful student gives us the false positive that things are moving in the right direction and that they're no longer feeling suicidal. We've unfortunately had some losses where that suddenly happy student had actually just come to terms with dying by suicide, and they felt a sense of relief. In both instances here, it warrants a conversation and using those skills you guys have as a trusted adult to determine what's going on with that student and making the appropriate referral to your school support staff. Changes in eating habits, and students who are isolated on the school bus or in the cafeteria. This is where that competent community model comes into play, where you have your auxiliary staff who may notice when somebody's no longer ordering lunch or they really overheard that drama that's going on in the cafeteria. Engaging them so that they know where they can talk to somebody when they're concerned about a student too will bring in together that whole school approach for prevention. Bullying behavior that we see in school, even as a bystander, can be something that is a warning sign for our students in terms of their risk for suicide. Some other scenarios that we have for warning signs that you may see in school: frequent visits to the school nurse, school avoidance, or typically just trying to get out of class, those somatic complaints that kids may go to the school nurse where it's nothing in particular, but it may be related to anxiety or other mental health issues. Actual threats or suicide notes, disturbing themes in school assignments, unusual pattern of absences or tardiness. You've noticed a change that your students are just cutting class or leaving school early entirely. And finally, concerns expressed by other students, and this is where students come into play as that most underutilized resource in schools. Students know, far beyond anybody else in our school population, what is going on with their peers, and we need to engage them into this prevention model in order to make significant change and to ultimately save lives. We're going to watch another video again with Maureen Underwood, who is going to walk you through what a warm handoff looks like. Typically, this is how you, as a trusted adult, has a conversation with students about the things you observed about their behavior that have changed and have you concerned, and how you get them to counseling. That's the warm part. How you get them there and how you engage them in a process that feels supportive and where they feel like they have control and structure. Remember, if you are so worried that the risk is seriously imminent and needs immediate attention, see something and say something immediately. Do not wait. Go immediately to the person listed in your school protocol or to a school administrator and inform them of your concerns. Tell them why you're concerned. Have those factual observations about your student's behavior written down and ready to go. Let them take over from there. Remember, your role is critical but limited. You've noticed the warning signs, the risk factors for the student. You've detailed them to your administrators or to those people in your building who are going to do a suicide risk assessment, and let them take over from there. Be sure to follow up, and make sure you also follow up with that student. So, now that we've talked about your role in suicide prevention, we're going to talk a little bit about the Lifelines trilogy you've heard so much about and how your school is reinforcing protection for your students. The Lifelines model is broken down into 3 key areas: postvention, intervention, and prevention. Postvention is the first piece that your school started with, and it's basically developing a crisis plan and protocols for responding to suicide and other traumatic deaths that your high school may go through. What we know about suicide loss, and specifically how suicide contagions start, is that an index death, or the first death experience, is usually not a suicide. And it's how we respond in the aftermath of that loss that could potentially put our students at further risk for feeling suicidal. The next piece of our training was the intervention piece, and this was for your school support staff so that they can understand how to help students at risk for suicide. This is where that suicide risk assessment comes into play, and now they know the questions to ask and the resources that are available to them in your community for helping students who are at risk for suicide and who are feeling suicidal. The final piece is prevention, and this is bringing knowledge and skills for preventing suicide directly to your students in your school building, as well as your full school staff and your parents as well. The goal of Lifelines prevention is to develop the school-based expertise and supports needed for responding to the problem of adolescent suicidal behavior. This was done in 3 phases within your school district. First, you had faculty and staff training, and that may have been either in the postvention, the intervention, or the prevention piece. Next, you move on to a parent workshop that informs your parents of the student curriculum that is coming, what their students will learn about, the resources available in your community, as well as what the referral process looks like for students in their school. This will also help parents who are worried about their children understand what they can do and their role in suicide prevention. Finally, the last component is the student curriculum. This specifically addresses grades 5 through 6, 7 through 10, and 11 through 12. The 11th through 12th grade piece is a new piece that we've developed specifically for that risk group of 18 to 24-year-olds and addressing the transition that comes along with graduating from high school and moving either into the workforce or moving on to college. We're going to go back to your role quickly and that critical but limited role you play in your school building in terms of suicide prevention for your students. One of the most significant protective factors, those green lights that help protect our students from suicide risk, is contact with a caring adult who they know and trust will do something about a problem they are experiencing. That adult could be you. I want to thank you all for being here today and taking a part in this suicide prevention training to learn more about the Lifelines curriculum and to better understand your role in suicide prevention. Thank you for taking care of our kids.